The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square as King Charles III stepped out of his official car. The crisp Roman air filled his lungs as he adjusted his dark navy suit and straightened the Windsor knot of his silk tie. Today marked a significant moment in his reign, his first official visit to the Vatican as the sovereign of the United Kingdom and supreme governor of the Church of England. Security personnel moved with practiced precision around the king, their earpieces crackling with quiet communications. The Swiss Guard stood at attention in their colorful uniforms, halberds gleaming in the morning light. Tourists and pilgrims had gathered behind barriers, many holding small British and Vatican flags, their excited whispers creating a gentle hum across the ancient stones. Charles paused for a moment, taking in the grandeur of Bernini's colonnade. The massive columns seemed to embrace the square, welcoming visitors from around the world. He had visited the Vatican before, but never in his capacity as king. The weight of representing not just himself, but the entire United Kingdom, settled on his shoulders like the ceremonial robes he would wear at state functions. Archbishop Michael Lewis, the king's representative to the Holy See, approached with a warm smile. His purple cassock rustled softly as he moved across the cobblestones. "Your Majesty, His Holiness is eager to receive you. The gift exchange ceremony has been carefully planned according to both Vatican protocol and your preferences." The king nodded, his weathered hands clasping behind his back. At 75, he had learned patience through decades of waiting to assume the throne. Now, each diplomatic encounter carried the full authority of the crown. "Archbishop, I trust the selections we discussed have been prepared appropriately?" "Indeed, Your Majesty. The craftsmen at Windsor have outdone themselves. I believe His Holiness will be genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness behind each piece." The archbishop gestured toward the Apostolic Palace, its Renaissance facade glowing golden in the morning sun. As they walked toward the entrance, Charles reflected on the careful preparation that had gone into this visit. Months of diplomatic correspondence had shaped every detail. The relationship between the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church had evolved significantly since the days of Henry VIII's break with Rome nearly 500 years ago. While theological differences remained, both churches now recognized their shared commitment to addressing global challenges like climate change, poverty, and social justice. The king's private secretary, James Harrison, walked 2 steps behind, carrying a leather portfolio containing detailed notes about the gift exchange protocol. Each item had been selected not just for its beauty or craftsmanship, but for its symbolic significance. The goal was to honor both the personal relationship between the two religious leaders and the broader diplomatic ties between their institutions. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the corridors seemed to whisper with centuries of history. Frescoes painted by masters adorned the walls, depicting scenes from scripture and church history. Swiss guards stood at intervals, their presence both ceremonial and functional. The king noticed how the marble floors reflected the soft lighting from crystal chandeliers, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. Cardinal Pietro Santori, the Vatican's Secretary of State, greeted them in the antechamber outside the Pope's private study. His red zucchetto sat perfectly centered on his gray hair, and his crimson cassock had been pressed to perfection for this important meeting. "Your Majesty, welcome to the Vatican." His Holiness has spoken often of his anticipation for this encounter. Charles extended his hand, noting the firm grip of the cardinal's handshake. "Cardinal Santori, the honor is entirely mine. I bring warm greetings from the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms." The cardinal smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "His Holiness has prepared something quite special for today's exchange." He spent considerable time selecting items that would reflect both his personal regard for Your Majesty and the deep respect he holds for the British people. Through the tall windows, the view extended across Rome, where ancient ruins stood alongside modern buildings, creating a tapestry of human civilization spanning millennia. The king found himself thinking about the continuity of institutions, how both the monarchy and the papacy had endured through countless changes in the world around them. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Monsignor Alessandro Benedetti, the Pope's private secretary, entered with quiet dignity. His black cassock was simple but elegant, befitting his role as one of the Pope's closest advisors. "Your Majesty, His Holiness is ready to receive you." The walk to the Pope's study felt both eternal and instantaneous. Charles had met Pope Francis before during various international gatherings, but this private audience carried different weight. Today they would exchange gifts not just as individuals, but as representatives of their respective institutions and the millions of faithful they served. The study door opened to reveal Pope Francis rising from behind his wooden desk. At 87, the Pope moved with the careful precision of age, but his eyes sparkled with the warmth that had made him beloved worldwide. His white cassock was pristine, and his silver pectoral cross caught the light as he stepped forward. "Your Majesty, what a joy to welcome you to our home," the Pope said, his English accented but clear. His smile transformed his entire face, conveying genuine pleasure at the meeting. Charles bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that acknowledged both the Pope's spiritual authority and their personal relationship. "Your Holiness, thank you for receiving me. I bring greetings from Her Majesty Queen Camilla and the warmest wishes of the British people." The two men embraced briefly, a moment captured by the official Vatican photographer whose camera clicked discreetly from the corner of the room. The image would later appear in newspapers worldwide, symbolizing the continued healing of ancient wounds between their churches. Pope Francis gestured toward two comfortable chairs arranged near the window overlooking the Vatican gardens. "Please, let us sit and speak before we proceed with the formal ceremonies. I have been looking forward to our conversation." The Vatican gardens spread below them like a green oasis in the heart of Rome. Ancient trees provided shade for walking paths where popes had contemplated for centuries. Charles noticed gardeners tending to flower beds, their work continuing the tradition of maintaining this sacred space as a place of beauty and reflection. "Your Holiness," Charles began, settling into his chair, "I wanted to personally thank you for your leadership on environmental issues. Your encyclical Laudato Si has influenced thinking far beyond Catholic circles." The Pope's eyes brightened at the mention of his landmark document on environmental stewardship. "Ah, Your Majesty, this is a concern we share deeply. The earth cries out to us, and we must listen. I know of your own longtime commitment to these issues, even when such positions were less popular." For the next hour, the two leaders discussed their shared concerns about climate change, social justice, and the role of faith in addressing modern challenges. Their conversation revealed not just diplomatic courtesy, but genuine intellectual engagement and mutual respect. Cardinal Santori eventually appeared at the study door, clearing his throat gently. "Your Holiness, forgive the interruption, but the delegation is assembled for the gift exchange ceremony." Pope Francis nodded and rose from his chair. "Of course. Your Majesty, shall we proceed to share these tokens of friendship between our communities?" Charles stood as well, straightening his jacket. "I am honored to participate in this tradition, Your Holiness." They moved to a larger reception room where the gifts had been carefully arranged on separate tables draped with white linen. Vatican officials and members of the king's retinue stood along the walls, their formal attire creating a dignified backdrop for the ceremony. The first gift from King Charles sat in an ornate wooden box lined with blue velvet. As the lid was lifted, it revealed a magnificent silver chalice crafted by the royal silversmiths at Garrett and Company. The cup bore intricate engravings depicting olive branches and doves, symbols of peace that both churches embraced. Around the base, Latin inscription read Pax et Concordia, peace and harmony. Pope Francis lifted the chalice carefully, examining the detailed workmanship. The silver caught the light, seeming to glow in his weathered hands. "Your Majesty, this is extraordinary. The craftsmanship speaks of both artistic excellence and spiritual significance. The silver comes from mines in Wales," Charles explained, "and the design incorporates elements sacred to both our traditions. The olive branches represent the peace that Christ promised, while the doves symbolize the Holy Spirit that guides both our churches." The Pope turned the chalice slowly, studying every detail of the engraving. The artisans had spent months perfecting each element, ensuring that the symbolic language would resonate with Catholic tradition while respecting Anglican sensibilities. Next, Charles presented a leather-bound first edition of John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, the Cardinal's defense of his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism. The book represented the complex history between their churches, acknowledging past divisions while celebrating the spiritual journey of one of the 19th century's greatest theological minds. "Cardinal Newman was recently canonized by your predecessor," Charles noted. "This edition represents our recognition that truth transcends institutional boundaries, and that saints can emerge from any authentic spiritual journey." Pope Francis opened the book carefully, his fingers tracing the original binding. Newman's words had influenced countless believers across denominational lines, and his canonization had been welcomed by many Anglicans as recognition of a shared spiritual heritage. The third gift required several Vatican staff members to carry it into the room. Wrapped in protective cloth was a painting commissioned specifically for this occasion by David Hockney, Britain's most celebrated living artist. The canvas depicted a peaceful garden scene where Anglican and Catholic symbols appeared naturally in the landscape, a Canterbury bell growing beside a papal lily, or robin, Britain's unofficial national bird, perched near a dove. As the wrapping fell away, Pope Francis stepped back in wonder. Hockney's distinctive style brought vibrant life to the symbolic garden, creating a visual metaphor for the possibility of unity amid diversity. "This is remarkable, Your Majesty. The artist has created something entirely new while honoring both our traditions." Charles smiled, pleased with the Pope's reaction. Mr. Hockney spent considerable time researching both Anglican and Catholic iconography. He wanted to create something that would speak to believers from both traditions without compromising either. The painting would eventually hang in the Pope's private apartments, a daily reminder of this historic exchange and the ongoing dialogue between their churches. Pope Francis then gestured toward his own gifts, arranged on the opposite table. His first offering was a reproduction of an ancient manuscript from the Vatican secret archives, a letter from Pope Gregory the Great to Augustine of Canterbury in the year 601, providing instructions for the evangelization of England. The document represented the deep historical connections between Rome and Britain, predating the later divisions by nearly 1,000 years. "This letter," the Pope explained, "shows that our churches shared a common mission long before political circumstances divided us." Augustine's work in Kent established foundations that endure to this day. Charles examined the carefully reproduced parchment, noting the elegant Latin script. The letter offered fascinating insights into early Christian mission work and the challenges of adapting the gospel message to different cultural contexts. The Pope's second gift was a contemporary work, a sculpture created by Vatican artisans from olive wood grown in the gardens of Gethsemane. The piece depicted two hands clasped in friendship, one bearing a ring with the papal seal, the other with the royal arms of the United Kingdom. The symbolism was clear and powerful. Despite theological differences, their shared commitment to Christian values created bonds of mutual respect and cooperation. "This olive wood is grown in the same soil where our Lord prayed before his crucifixion," Pope Francis explained. "It seems appropriate that wood from such a sacred place should symbolize our friendship and shared mission." Charles lifted the sculpture carefully, feeling the smooth finish and noting the skilled carving that had transformed raw wood into a powerful symbol of unity. The piece would find a place of honor at Windsor Castle, reminding him daily of this meaningful encounter. The final gift from Pope Francis was deeply personal, a handwritten letter expressing his hopes for continued dialogue between their churches and his personal prayers for Charles's reign. The letter, written in the Pope's careful script, contained passages in both English and Spanish, reflecting the Pope's multicultural background and global perspective. As the formal exchange concluded, both leaders stood quietly for a moment, surrounded by these tangible symbols of respect and friendship. The gifts represented more than diplomatic courtesy, they embodied hopes for healing, understanding, and cooperation in addressing the challenges facing both their communities and the world at large. Cardinal Santori stepped forward with a ceremonial document recording the exchange for the Vatican archives. Such records would allow future historians to understand not just what was exchanged, but why these particular gifts were chosen and what they represented for the relationship between the Anglican and Catholic churches in the 21st century. The King's private secretary made similar notes for the British official records, ensuring that this historic moment would be preserved in the royal archives alongside centuries of other diplomatic encounters. These seemingly administrative details were actually crucial for maintaining institutional memory and providing context for future generations of leaders. As photographers documented the gifts and the leaders examined each piece more closely, the atmosphere in the room remained reverent but warm. Staff members from both sides chatted quietly about the artistic and symbolic significance of what they were witnessing. Pope Francis invited Charles to join him for a private walk in the Vatican gardens, suggesting they could continue their conversation in the peaceful setting where popes had found inspiration for nearly 2 centuries. The gardens would provide a fitting conclusion to their formal meeting and an opportunity for more personal reflection on their shared concerns and hopes. The afternoon sun filtered through ancient pine trees as Pope Francis and King Charles walked slowly along the gravel paths of the Vatican gardens. Their footsteps crunched softly on the carefully maintained walkways while Swiss guards followed at a discreet distance, their presence felt but not intrusive. The formal gift exchange had concluded successfully, but both leaders sensed that their most meaningful conversations might happen away from cameras and ceremonial protocol. "Your Majesty," the Pope began, gesturing toward a particularly beautiful rose garden. I often find that walking helps the mind process what the heart already knows. Today's exchange of gifts was beautiful, but I sense we both hope for something deeper than symbolic gestures. Charles nodded thoughtfully, his hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic pose. The king had always found peace in gardens, and the Vatican's green spaces reminded him of the private areas at Highgrove House where he had spent decades developing sustainable farming practices. Your Holiness, I believe we share a recognition that our churches face challenges that require cooperation rather than continued separation. They paused beside a fountain where water danced in the afternoon light. The sound provided a gentle backdrop to their conversation while ensuring privacy from any potential listeners. Around them, ancient olive trees stretched toward the Roman sky, their twisted trunks bearing witness to countless papal conversations over the centuries. Pope Francis smiled, his weathered face reflecting both wisdom and genuine warmth. When I was a young priest in Buenos Aires, I never imagined I would one day walk with the King of England, discussing how to heal wounds that have divided Christians for 500 years. Yet here we are, proof that God works through the most unlikely circumstances. The king chuckled softly at the Pope's observation. His own path to the throne had been anything but conventional, marked by decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges that had ultimately strengthened his character and deepened his faith. I have learned that the most important conversations often happen in the most unexpected moments, Your Holiness. Their walk took them past the Grotto of Lourdes, where a replica of the famous French shrine provided a quiet space for prayer and reflection. Several visitors knelt before the statue of the Virgin Mary, their quiet devotions creating an atmosphere of reverence that both leaders respected with their silence as they passed. Your Majesty, the Pope eventually continued, I have been thinking much about the gifts we exchanged today. The chalice you presented, it speaks to something I believe both our communities hunger for, the ability to share the cup of blessing despite our institutional differences. Charles had hoped the Pope would understand the deeper significance behind the chalice's design. The royal silversmiths had consulted with both Anglican and Catholic liturgical experts to ensure that every element would resonate authentically with both traditions. The craftsmen told me that working on this piece challenged them to think beyond their usual constraints. They had to find visual language that honored both our traditions without compromising either. Pope Francis stopped walking and turned to face the king directly. This is precisely what I believe the Holy Spirit is calling both our churches to do, find new ways to express ancient truths that speak to contemporary hearts. The divisions of the 16th century need not define Christian relationships in the 21st century. The conversation was moving beyond diplomatic pleasantries into theological territory that both men found energizing. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Charles understood the historical reasons for Anglican-Catholic separation, but he also recognized that many of those issues had evolved significantly over the centuries. They resumed walking toward the Vatican's greenhouse complex, where Pope Francis had developed a reputation for personally tending to plants and flowers. The Pope's connection to nature aligned closely with Charles's own environmental passions, providing another point of connection between the two leaders. Your Holiness, Charles said as they approached the greenhouse entrance, your encyclical on environmental stewardship resonated deeply with me because it connected spiritual responsibility with practical action. The Church of England has been developing similar theological frameworks for creation care. Inside the greenhouse, the warm, humid air carried the scents of exotic flowers and herbs from around the world. Pope Francis moved among the plants with obvious familiarity, occasionally adjusting stakes or checking soil moisture with the practiced hands of someone who genuinely enjoyed gardening work. These plants come from every continent, the Pope explained, gently touching the leaves of a small tree from his native Argentina. They remind me daily that God's creation transcends human boundaries. Perhaps our churches could learn from this botanical example of unity in diversity. Charles examined a collection of British wildflowers that had been cultivated in one corner of the greenhouse. Seeing familiar species thriving in Roman soil provided a perfect metaphor for the kind of international cooperation both leaders envisioned. These flowers from home seem quite comfortable in Vatican soil, Your Holiness. The Pope laughed at the observation, clearly pleased with the king's ability to find meaning in simple natural phenomena. Indeed. And notice how they enhance rather than compete with the other species around them. This is what I pray our churches might achieve, not uniformity, but harmony. Their greenhouse tour attracted the attention of the Vatican's chief gardener, Brother Mario Santini, a Franciscan friar whose weathered hands testify to decades of working the Vatican soil. He approached with obvious excitement at having both leaders visit his domain. Your Holiness, Your Majesty, Brother Mario said in accented English, bowing slightly, it is my great honor to welcome you to see God's small miracles that grow here. Pope Francis beamed at the gardener's enthusiasm. Brother Mario tends these plants with more care than many people give to their own families. He understands that nurturing growth requires patience, attention, and love. Charles shook the friar's dirt-stained hand warmly, recognizing in Brother Mario a kindred spirit who understood that working with growing things provided both practical benefits and spiritual lessons. Brother, I would love to hear about your methods. I suspect we might learn from each other's approaches to sustainable cultivation. For the next 30 minutes, the three men discussed everything from soil composition to companion planting techniques. Their conversation revealed how shared practical interests could bridge cultural and institutional differences more effectively than formal theological debates. Brother Mario showed them an experimental section where he was developing drought-resistant varieties of traditional European flowers. Climate change affects even Vatican gardens, he explained. We must adapt while preserving the beauty that has inspired visitors for centuries. The king nodded appreciatively at the friar's forward-thinking approach. This is exactly the kind of innovative stewardship that both our institutions should be modeling. Honoring tradition while adapting to contemporary realities. Pope Francis watched the interaction between Charles and Brother Mario with obvious satisfaction. Their mutual respect and shared enthusiasm for practical environmental solutions demonstrated the kind of collaborative spirit he hoped to see between their churches. As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Brother Mario presented both leaders with small potted plants native to their respective regions, an English lavender for the king and an Argentine jasmine for the Pope. These will remind you that friendship, like gardens, requires tending but produces beauty that enriches everyone who encounters it. Back outside in the garden's main pathways, their conversation turned to more strategic questions about the future of Anglican-Catholic relations. Both leaders understood that personal friendship, while important, would need to translate into concrete steps toward greater cooperation. Your Majesty, Pope Francis said as they walked toward the garden's highest point, which offered views across Rome, I have been consulting with the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity about practical steps our churches might take together. Charles had been hoping the conversation would move in this direction. The Anglican Communion had been engaged in similar discussions about opportunities for expanded cooperation with Rome. Our Archbishop of Canterbury has expressed similar interests, Your Holiness. We believe there are areas where our shared witness could be more effective than our separate efforts. The view from the garden's summit was spectacular, encompassing both ancient Rome's archaeological treasures and the modern city's bustling neighborhoods. The perspective seemed to emphasize how institutions like theirs needed to balance respect for historical foundations with engagement with contemporary realities. Look there, the Pope said, pointing toward the distant outline of the Colosseum. Early Christians died in that arena for their faith. They were not Anglican or Catholic, they were simply followers of Jesus Christ. Perhaps we have sometimes allowed later distinctions to obscure that fundamental unity. Charles followed the Pope's gaze, thinking about the martyrs whose sacrifice had planted the seeds of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Those early believers had faced persecution without the theological safeguards and institutional structures that later Christians took for granted. Your Holiness, Charles said thoughtfully, I often wonder what those early Christians would think of our modern divisions. They surely would have been more concerned with faithful witness than with maintaining institutional boundaries. Pope Francis nodded emphatically. This is why I believe the Holy Spirit may be calling us to focus more on what unites us than on what divides us. Not compromising our convictions, but finding ways to express them that build bridges rather than walls. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cardinal Santori, who approached with obvious reluctance to disturb their private discussion. Your Holiness, forgive the interruption, but the evening prayer service begins shortly, and both Your Majesty and yourself are expected. The Pope checked his watch and sighed slightly. Of course. Your Majesty, would you honor us by joining our evening prayer? I know our liturgical styles differ, but prayer itself transcends such distinctions. Charles accepted the invitation gladly. Participating in Vatican evening prayer would provide an appropriate spiritual conclusion to their day of dialogue and gift exchange. It would also demonstrate the kind of respectful participation in each other's worship traditions that both leaders hoped to encourage. As they walked toward St. Peter's Basilica for the evening service, Pope Francis shared his thoughts about the gifts Charles had presented earlier. The Newman book particularly moved me, Your Majesty. His spiritual journey reminds us that truth-seeking sometimes requires crossing boundaries that others consider permanent. Charles had specifically chosen the Newman volume because the cardinal's story illustrated how individual spiritual journeys could transcend institutional limitations while still respecting both starting and ending points. Cardinal Newman never rejected his Anglican formation, even after his conversion. He integrated it into a fuller understanding of Christian tradition. The basilica's massive doors stood open as they approached, and the sound of Gregorian chant drifted into the evening air. Swiss guards snapped to attention as the Pope and King passed, their colorful uniforms adding ceremonial dignity to the procession. Inside the basilica, the scale was overwhelming despite both leaders' familiarity with grand religious architecture. Michelangelo's dome soared above them while Bernini's bronze canopy over the papal altar created a focal point that drew the eye upward toward the divine. Evening light filtered through the basilica's windows, creating pools of colored light on the marble floors where countless pilgrims had knelt in prayer. The atmosphere was simultaneously intimate and majestic, providing an ideal setting for contemplative worship. Pope Francis led Charles to a reserved section near the altar where they would participate in Vespers alongside Vatican clergy and staff. The king appreciated being included as a participant rather than merely an observer, understanding that this gesture represented significant trust and respect. As the service began, both leaders found themselves caught up in the ancient rhythms of Christian prayer that had sustained believers for nearly 2 millennia. The Latin chants and scriptural readings created a sense of connection with generations of faithful who had prayed these same words in this same sacred space. During the service, Charles reflected on the day's exchanges and conversations. The gifts they had shared were beautiful and meaningful, but the real treasure had been the opportunity for genuine dialogue about shared hopes and concerns. Such conversations planted seeds that might eventually bloom into expanded cooperation between their churches. Pope Francis, meanwhile, prayed silently for wisdom in nurturing the relationship that seemed to be developing between himself and the British monarch. Personal friendship was valuable, but both men carried responsibilities to vast communities of believers who deserved leadership that served their spiritual needs above personal preferences. As Vespers concluded and the evening's first stars appeared through the basilica's windows, both leaders understood that their historic day together had established foundations for future collaboration that might extend far beyond their own tenures in office. The following morning arrived with crisp October air and golden sunlight streaming through the windows of the Apostolic Palace. King Charles had spent the night at the British Embassy to the Holy See, but he returned early for a private breakfast with Pope Francis before the day's more formal activities began. This informal meal would give both leaders a chance to continue their conversations away from the structured protocols that governed most papal audiences. Monsignor Benedetti escorted Charles through corridors lined with Renaissance masterpieces to a small dining room in the Pope's private apartments. The space was surprisingly modest, reflecting Pope Francis's well-known preference for simplicity over ostentation. A simple wooden table was set for two, with fresh flowers from the Vatican gardens providing the only decoration. Pope Francis was already seated, reading what appeared to be morning briefing papers while sipping coffee from a plain ceramic mug. He looked up with genuine pleasure as Charles entered, rising to greet his guest with the warmth that had become his trademark during his pontificate. "Your Majesty, I hope you slept well at the embassy. I always enjoy these quiet morning moments before the day becomes consumed with meetings and ceremonies," the Pope said, gesturing for Charles to take the seat across from him. Charles settled into his chair, appreciating the informal atmosphere. After decades of royal protocol, he had learned to value occasions when genuine conversation could flourish without excessive ceremony. "Your Holiness, I did indeed sleep well, though I found myself thinking long into the night about our conversations yesterday." A Vatican staff member appeared with coffee and a simple breakfast of fresh bread, local honey, and seasonal fruit. Both leaders ate with the unhurried pace of men who understood that rushing through meals diminished both nutrition and conversation quality. "I have been reflecting as well," Pope Francis said, breaking off a piece of bread and spreading it with honey. "Particularly about your observation regarding the early Christian martyrs. It strikes me that they faced their ultimate test not as members of competing denominations, but as witnesses to shared truth." Charles nodded while considering how to express thoughts that had been forming since their previous day's discussions. "Your Holiness, I believe we may be experiencing a providential moment when institutional concerns must yield to missionary necessities. The challenges facing Christian communities worldwide require responses that transcend our historical divisions." The Pope's eyes brightened at this observation. Throughout his pontificate, he had consistently emphasized mercy and mission over rigid adherence to regulatory structures. Yes, exactly. The peripheries where our people suffer do not recognize Anglican versus Catholic distinctions. They recognize authentic Christian love and service, or they recognize its absence. Their breakfast conversation gradually focused on specific areas where their churches might collaborate more effectively. Education emerged as a particularly promising arena, given both institutions' extensive networks of schools and universities around the world. The University of Cambridge has been exploring partnerships with pontifical universities, Charles mentioned. There seems to be tremendous potential for collaborative research on everything from social justice to environmental sustainability. Pope Francis leaned forward with obvious interest. This is precisely the kind of practical cooperation that could transform abstract theological discussions into concrete witness. When scholars from our traditions work together on pressing human problems, artificial barriers begin to dissolve. They spend considerable time discussing global refugee crises and how their respective charitable organizations might coordinate more effectively. Catholic relief services and Anglican-affiliated aid organizations often worked in the same regions with similar goals but limited coordination. Imagine if our relief efforts were synchronized, the Pope suggested. Not merged or compromised, but coordinated to maximize impact while maintaining our distinct spiritual identities. Charles pulled out a small notebook where he had been recording ideas that emerged from their conversations. Your Holiness, would you consider establishing a joint working group to explore such possibilities? I believe both our organizations would benefit from systematic examination of collaboration opportunities. The Pope immediately endorsed this suggestion, recognizing its potential for producing concrete results rather than merely symbolic gestures. Cardinal Santori could work with your representatives to identify specific projects where coordination might prove beneficial. As breakfast concluded, both leaders understood that they had moved beyond diplomatic courtesy into serious strategic planning. Their personal rapport was enabling institutional innovation that might have seemed impossible under different circumstances. Monsignor Benedetti appeared discreetly at the dining room entrance, indicating that the morning's scheduled activities needed to begin. The Pope and King had planned to visit a Roman parish together, demonstrating their shared commitment to local Christian communities while providing ordinary believers an opportunity to encounter both leaders simultaneously. The parish of San Giuseppe al Trionfale had been selected carefully for this visit. Located in a middle-class Roman neighborhood, it represented the kind of everyday Christian community that both leaders hoped to serve through their collaboration. The parish priest, Father Alessandro Romano, had worked for months preparing his congregation for this unprecedented visit. Their motorcade wound through Rome's morning traffic toward the parish, passing ancient ruins and modern apartment blocks that testify to the city's layered history. Swiss guards and British security personnel coordinated their protective details while maintaining the informal atmosphere both leaders preferred. San Giuseppe was a 20th-century church, built in the practical style favored by Vatican architects of that era. Its brick facade and simple bell tower reflected the modest means of the working-class families who had originally supported its construction. Today, colorful banners hung from the entrance while parishioners gathered in their Sunday best despite the weekday schedule. Father Romano waited nervously at the church entrance, flanked by parish staff and lay leaders who had helped organize the visit. His black cassock had been pressed to perfection, and his silver hair was carefully combed, but his hands trembled slightly as he watched the motorcade approach. Pope Francis emerged from his vehicle first, immediately embracing Father Romano with the affectionate warmth he showed to parish priests worldwide. Padre Alessandro, how wonderful to visit your beautiful community. I hope our presence here will be a blessing rather than a disruption. King Charles followed, shaking hands formally with the priest before Pope Francis introduced him to the parish leadership. The king's genuine interest in each person he met was evident as he asked questions about their roles in parish life and listened attentively to their responses. Your Majesty, Father Romano said in careful English, our people are so honored by your visit. Many of them have never imagined seeing the Pope and the King of England together in their own church. Inside, the church was filled to capacity with parishioners ranging from elderly grandmothers to young families with small children. The atmosphere buzzed with excited anticipation tempered by reverent respect for their sacred space. Flowers from parish gardens decorated the altar while a children's choir practiced quietly in the side chapel. Both leaders took seats in the front pew, deliberately choosing simple wooden chairs rather than any special furnishings. This gesture was not lost on the congregation, who appreciated their leader's willingness to worship as ordinary believers rather than demanding special accommodations. The service began with traditional Catholic liturgy, but Father Romano had incorporated elements designed to acknowledge the Anglican tradition without compromising Catholic theological integrity. Scripture readings emphasized unity in Christ, while prayers requested blessings for both church leaders and their communities. During his homily, Father Romano spoke about the significance of the visit while avoiding political commentary. Today we witness something remarkable: two servants of Christ, from different traditions, sharing our simple worship. They remind us that Christian love transcends institutional boundaries. Pope Francis and King Charles both participated fully in the service, standing for hymns and kneeling for prayers alongside ordinary parishioners. Their presence transformed routine morning worship into a historic demonstration of Christian unity and mutual respect. Following the liturgy, both leaders addressed the congregation briefly. Pope Francis spoke in Italian, emphasizing themes of mercy, service, and Christian witness in contemporary society. His words were simultaneously pastoral and prophetic, challenging parishioners to live their faith boldly while serving those in need. King Charles delivered his remarks in English, with Father Romano providing Italian translation. He focused on shared Christian values that unite believers across denominational lines, particularly the call to stewardship of God's creation and care for society's most vulnerable members. "Your beautiful parish," the king said, "demonstrates how Christian communities can be anchors of hope and service in their neighborhoods." The Church of England and the Catholic Church both aspire to this kind of faithful witness. After the formal service, both leaders spent an hour meeting individually with parishioners. They blessed children, prayed with elderly members, and listened to personal stories of faith and struggle. These encounters provided both leaders insights into how their theological discussions translated into ordinary believers' daily experiences. Maria Gonzalez, a middle-aged widow caring for her disabled mother, approached Pope Francis with tears in her eyes. "Your Holiness, seeing you and the King together gives me hope that even impossible reconciliations can happen." The Pope took her hands gently, speaking quietly in Spanish before blessing her in Latin. Her encounter represented countless similar interactions throughout the morning, where individual believers found personal meaning in the symbolic unity their leaders were demonstrating. Charles found himself equally moved by personal encounters with parishioners. Young Giuseppe Marconi, studying engineering at the University of Rome, asked thoughtful questions about integrating faith with scientific education. Their conversation reminded the king why educational collaboration between their institutions could produce such significant benefits. The parish visit concluded with both leaders planting a small olive tree in the church courtyard. Father Romano had suggested this symbolic act, noting that olive trees required decades to reach maturity but could then produce fruit for centuries. The metaphor perfectly captured their hopes for Anglican-Catholic relations. As they returned to their vehicles, Pope Francis reflected on the morning's experience. "Your Majesty, I believe we have witnessed something profound today. These ordinary believers understand unity in ways that sometimes elude theologians and diplomats." Charles agreed wholeheartedly. "Your Holiness, their faith seems so natural and unpretentious. They accept our friendship as evidence of God's goodness rather than as a theological puzzle requiring complex explanation." Their next stop was the Pontifical Urban University, where they would address an audience of seminarians and graduate students from around the world. This academic setting would allow both leaders to explore more sophisticated theological and practical questions about Christian unity and cooperation. The university's main auditorium was packed with young people preparing for ministry in various Christian denominations. Many had come from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, representing the global character of contemporary Christianity. Their enthusiasm was palpable as both leaders entered the hall to sustained applause. Cardinal Luis Tagle, the university's chancellor, introduced both speakers while emphasizing the historic significance of their joint appearance. "Today you witness something your grandparents could hardly have imagined, the Pope and the King of England addressing future Christian leaders together." Pope Francis spoke first, challenging the students to think beyond traditional institutional boundaries while maintaining respect for their particular traditions. "Your generation will inherit the task of healing divisions that previous generations were unable to resolve. This requires both wisdom and courage." King Charles followed with remarks about the Church of England's experience balancing Anglican identity with ecumenical cooperation. He emphasized how younger Christians often approached inter-church relations with fresh perspectives unconstrained by historical prejudices. The question period proved particularly engaging, with students asking thoughtful questions about practical challenges facing Christian unity. Their questions revealed sophisticated understanding of theological issues combined with passionate concern for effective Christian witness in contemporary society. One student from Nigeria asked how local churches could implement the kind of cooperation being modeled by their leaders. Both Pope Francis and King Charles acknowledged that grassroots initiatives often faced obstacles that high-level diplomacy could not easily address. Another student from Brazil inquired about environmental cooperation between their churches, noting that climate change particularly affected the global south where both Catholic and Anglican communities were expanding rapidly. These interactions confirmed both leaders' conviction that younger Christians were natural allies in promoting inter-church cooperation. Their questions suggested that future generations might accomplish reconciliation that had eluded their predecessors. The final evening of King Charles's historic Vatican visit arrived with the golden light that made Rome particularly beautiful in late autumn. The formal ceremonies had concluded successfully, but both leaders had reserved their last hours together for the most significant conversation of the entire visit. In the Pope's private study, they would draft a joint statement that would define their shared vision for Anglican-Catholic relations in the coming decades. Cardinal Santori and Archbishop Louis had prepared preliminary documents, but both leaders insisted on personally crafting the language that would communicate their hopes to their respective communities. This statement would need to balance theological precision with pastoral warmth, acknowledging past wounds while pointing toward future possibilities. Pope Francis sat at his wooden desk while King Charles occupied a comfortable chair nearby, both men surrounded by reference books, official church documents, and handwritten notes from their previous day's conversations. The atmosphere was scholarly but warm, reflecting their shared commitment to producing something meaningful rather than merely diplomatic. Your Majesty, the Pope began, reviewing a draft paragraph, I want to ensure our statement speaks to ordinary believers, not just theologians and church officials. The people we met yesterday at San Giuseppe understand Christian unity in their hearts, our words should honor that instinct. Charles nodded while reviewing his own notes from parish encounters. Your Holiness, I was particularly struck by how naturally those parishioners accepted our friendship. They seemed surprised that anyone would find it unusual for Christian leaders to cooperate and care for each other. Their drafting process was meticulous, with each sentence examined for theological accuracy, pastoral sensitivity, and practical implications. Both leaders understood that their words would be analyzed by scholars, quoted in sermons, and referenced in future ecumenical discussions for years to come. The statement's opening paragraphs established their shared commitment to Christian witness while acknowledging the historical complexity of Anglican-Catholic relations. They avoided rehashing old controversies, instead focusing on contemporary opportunities for collaboration in addressing global challenges. We write as servants of Jesus Christ who recognize in each other authentic Christian faith and leadership, their draft began. While our churches maintain distinct theological positions on certain issues, we affirm our shared commitment to the gospel's transforming power in human lives and societies. Pope Francis suggested adding language about the urgency of Christian cooperation in addressing contemporary crises. Your Majesty, our people face challenges that require responses transcending denominational boundaries. Climate change, global poverty, and religious persecution affect all our communities. Charles enthusiastically endorsed this emphasis on practical collaboration. The statement evolved to include specific commitments regarding environmental stewardship, refugee assistance, and educational cooperation. These concrete areas would provide frameworks for implementing their general principles. Their most delicate challenge involved articulating theological differences honestly while maintaining an ironic tone. Both leaders were committed to avoiding false unity that ignored genuine disagreements, but they also wanted to demonstrate that such differences need not prevent collaboration on shared concerns. Perhaps we could acknowledge that our theological conversations will continue, Charles suggested, while affirming that such dialogue occurs within the context of mutual respect and Christian charity. The Pope agreed with this approach. Yes, and we should emphasize that theological dialogue serves the mission we share rather than competing with it. Our goal is not uniformity but harmony in witness. As evening shadows lengthened across the Vatican gardens visible through the study windows, both leaders felt the weight of history settling on their shoulders. They were crafting words that might influence Christian relationships for generations while also trying to honor the specific moment they had shared during this visit. Cardinal Santori appeared with tea and light refreshments, noting that Vatican staff were assembling in the adjacent room to review the statement for final editing. Both leaders appreciated having professional assistance with technical details while maintaining personal control over the document's essential content. "Your Holiness," Charles said during their break, "I hope this statement will encourage other Christian leaders to risk similar conversations." Personal relationships often accomplish what institutional negotiations cannot achieve. Pope Francis smiled at this observation. "Indeed, Your Majesty. The Holy Spirit works through friendship as much as through formal theology. Perhaps our churches need more opportunities for leaders to share meals, worship together, and discover their common ground." Their statement's final sections addressed implementation, establishing working groups to explore educational partnerships, environmental cooperation, and coordinated charitable activities. These practical measures would provide concrete ways for local churches to participate in the unity their leaders were modeling. The document concluded with a joint prayer that both leaders had composed together, drawing on biblical imagery of reconciliation and Christian hope. "May the God of peace grant wisdom to all who serve Christ's mission in the world, that ancient divisions might yield to contemporary cooperation in proclaiming gospel hope." As Cardinal Santori and Archbishop Louis reviewed the completed statement, both leaders felt satisfaction mixed with anticipation. They had produced something that expressed their authentic convictions while opening new possibilities for their church's relationship. "Your Majesty," Pope Francis said as they prepared for the statement's release, "I believe we have planted seeds that others will need to nurture. Neither of us will live to see the full fruits of what we have begun." Charles appreciated the Pope's realistic perspective on the timeline for institutional change. "Your Holiness, that recognition makes our work more precious rather than less significant. We are serving future generations of believers who deserve better than the divisions they have inherited." The formal presentation of their joint statement occurred in the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, with representatives from both churches present alongside international media. The setting emphasized the historic significance of their collaboration while providing an appropriate backdrop for announcing their shared vision. Both leaders spoke briefly about the statement's significance before taking questions from journalists. Their responses demonstrated the genuine partnership they had developed over the previous days while reinforcing their commitment to the practical cooperation they had outlined. When asked about potential opposition from traditionalists in both churches, Pope Francis responded with characteristic directness. "Change always provokes anxiety in some quarters, but Christian tradition includes a consistent call to unity that transcends human divisions." King Charles addressed similar questions by emphasizing that cooperation did not require abandoning distinctive Anglican principles. "The Church of England's commitment to Reformed Catholic identity actually compels us toward dialogue with the Bishop of Rome, not away from it." Their press conference concluded with both leaders signing official copies of the statement that would be distributed to churches worldwide. The signing ceremony was photographed extensively, providing images that would symbolize this historic moment in Christian history. Following the media presentation, both leaders participated in a private reception with Vatican officials and members of the King's delegation. The informal atmosphere allowed everyone involved to reflect on the significance of what they had witnessed and participated in during the visit. Cardinal Tagle approached Charles during the reception to express his appreciation for the King's theological sophistication and pastoral sensitivity. "Your Majesty, your contributions to our discussions have enriched Catholic understanding of Anglican perspectives." Archbishop Louis similarly thanked Pope Francis for his hospitality and theological generosity. "Your Holiness, this visit has exceeded our highest expectations for productive dialogue and meaningful cooperation." As the reception continued, both leaders found opportunities for final conversations with various officials and staff members who had contributed to the visit's success. These personal expressions of gratitude acknowledged that institutional achievements always depend on dedicated individuals working behind the scenes. Brother Mario, the Vatican gardener, presented both leaders with small bouquets of flowers from the Vatican gardens, symbolizing the growth and beauty that could emerge from careful tending of relationships between their churches. The visit's final official event was a brief prayer service in the Sistine Chapel, where both leaders offered thanksgiving for their time together while praying for wisdom and implementing their shared commitments. The chapel's magnificent frescoes provided an inspiring backdrop for their concluding worship. Surrounded by Michelangelo's artistic interpretation of salvation history, both leaders felt connected to the centuries of Christian witness that had preceded them and the generations that would follow. Their contemporary efforts at reconciliation were part of a larger story of God's work in human history. As they prepared for departure, King Charles and Pope Francis exchanged final private words of gratitude and encouragement. Their personal relationship had deepened significantly during the visit, providing a foundation for the institutional cooperation they hoped to foster. "Your Majesty," the Pope said as they stood in the courtyard where the King's vehicles waited, "I pray that our friendship will inspire others to risk similar conversations. The Church needs leaders willing to cross traditional boundaries for the sake of gospel witness." Charles clasped the Pope's hand warmly, feeling genuine affection for this man who had become both a diplomatic partner and personal friend. "Your Holiness, you have taught me that unity does not require uniformity, and that differences can enhance rather than threaten authentic relationship." The departure ceremony was deliberately simple, reflecting both leaders' preference for substance over ceremony. Swiss guards stood at attention while Vatican staff gathered to bid farewell to the British delegation. As King Charles's motorcade departed the Vatican, both leaders understood that they had established foundations for relationships that would extend far beyond their personal tenures in office. The gifts they had exchanged would remain in their respective collections, but the trust they had built would influence church relations for decades to come. The joint statement they had crafted would be studied in seminaries, referenced in ecumenical dialogues, and implemented through countless local initiatives. Their personal friendship had created institutional possibilities that neither church could have imagined just a few years earlier. In the months and years that followed, working groups established during the visit would produce concrete collaborations in environmental stewardship, refugee assistance, and educational partnerships. Local parishes would develop relationships across denominational lines, inspired by the example their leaders had set. The historic gift exchange between King Charles and Pope Francis had accomplished far more than diplomatic protocol required. It had demonstrated that ancient divisions need not define contemporary relationships, and that personal friendship between leaders could open institutional possibilities that formal negotiations might never achieve. Their legacy would be measured not in the beautiful objects they had exchanged, but in the transformed relationships between churches that had been separated for 5 centuries. The olive wood sculpture and silver chalice would remind future generations that Christian unity, like friendship itself, required patience, respect, and genuine commitment to the common good. As the sun set over Rome on the final evening of this historic visit, both St. Peter's Basilica and the lights of the modern city testified to the continuity of Christian presence in the Eternal City. The conversation between the Pope and the King had added another chapter to that long story, one that future generations would remember as a moment when ancient walls began to crumble and new possibilities emerged. Their gift exchange had become a symbol of hope for all who believed that Christian unity was not only possible but essential for the Church's mission in the contemporary world. The friendship between Pope Francis and King Charles III had planted seeds of reconciliation that would bear fruit long after both men had completed their earthly service to the communities they loved and served.